You're tuning into the deep dive because you want to cut through the noise, understand what really matters quickly and thoroughly.
Yeah, and we get an information overload as well, it's real.
So let's dive straight into something fascinating today, something that can make a huge difference in how we understand learning.
Absolutely. Today, we're zeroing in on a critical aspect of educational studies. It's about how we design them to really see if a new teaching method or, say, a tool is making a difference for students.
Right.
We've been looking at some pretty compelling findings from a research article. It's called Single and Multi-Level Perspectives on Covariate Selection in Randomized Intervention Studies on Student Achievement. Quite a mouthful.
Okay, so the core issue, the nut of it is this. When we're testing something new in education, how do we best use the info we already have? You know, about students, like their past test scores or maybe their backgrounds. How do we use that to get the clearest picture of whether the new thing is actually working?
Exactly. And this is key whether we're looking at individual students or entire classrooms, even whole schools.
Right, different levels.
Precisely. The researchers behind this paper, they dove deep into a massive pool of data.
Okay.
We're talking results from large-scale tests given to students all across Germany, from grade 1 right up to grade 12.
Wow, that's comprehensive.
It is, and covering a really wide range of subjects, too. So think of it as a very thorough look at how different bits of prior information connect to future learning.
That is an incredible amount of data to work with.
Yeah.
So for our listeners today, what's our goal with this deep dive? What's the mission?
Our mission really is to pull out the most valuable insights from this research and give you some, practical takeaways.
Actionable stuff.
Yes, actionable insights on how to select these upfront pieces of information, these covariates as they're called, to make educational studies more powerful, more precise.
Okay.
We're talking evidence-based strategies here to make sure we're getting results that actually mean something.
All right, so covariates. Why is picking the right one such a big deal? Why is it a game changer?
Well, it really boils down to something called design sensitivity.
Design sensitivity, okay.
Yeah, imagine you're trying to spot, like, a tiny fish in a really big pond.
Okay.
A study with high design sensitivity, it's like having crystal clear water. You're much, much more likely to see that fish, the real effect of your intervention, even if it's small.
Without needing a giant net or, like, draining the whole pond.
Exactly, without having to drain the entire pond, which in research terms means recruiting thousands and thousands of participants.
Got it. So it's about being sharp, efficient in our research designs. Can you give us a concrete example? Like, how big a difference can this actually make?
Oh, absolutely. The research gives a great example. They talk about a cluster randomized trial. That's where you assign whole groups, like classrooms.
Right, not individual students.
Exactly. So say you're looking at math achievement in fourth graders. If you don't properly account for any prior learning, you might need, get this, over 4,000 students to be confident in your findings.
4,000. That sounds like a logistical nightmare.
It really is. But, and here's where it gets really interesting, if you choose good covariates relevant info about the students before the study kicks off, that same study might only need around, say, 1,400 students.
From 4,000 down to 1,400.
Yes. To get the same level of confidence in the results, that's a massive saving. Resources, time, effort. It makes rigorous research just much more achievable.
That is a truly staggering difference.
Yeah.
So, okay, we see why it matters a lot. But the article also mentioned something interesting, that there isn't always super clear advice on how to actually pick these covariates.
That's right.
It's not like there's some magic formula everyone uses.
Exactly. It's kind of surprising, actually. Everyone in the field knows how important this is, but the specific guidelines, the best practices, they can be, well, surprisingly fuzzy sometimes. So this research really aims to provide more concrete, data-driven guidance based on all that German assessment data.
Okay, good. So what kinds of pre-treatment info did these researchers actually look at? What are the main types of covariates we should be thinking about?
They focused on 4 key categories. First up, there's the domain identical pretest. We can call it IP.
IP, domain identical. Makes sense.
Yeah, think of it as testing students on the exact same subject they'll be measuring later on. So if your intervention is a new reading program,
then the IP covariate is their reading score from before the program started.
Precisely. It's very intuitive.
Yeah, that makes total sense. What you knew before in the same area is probably a strong predictor of where you'll end up. Okay, what's the second type?
The second is the cross-domain pretest, or CP.
Cross-domain. So different subject.
Exactly. This is prior knowledge in a different subject. For instance, using student scores on, say, a language arts test to predict how they'll do in a math intervention.
Hmm, interesting. You might not immediately think those would be quite as tightly linked as the same subject.
Well, you might be surprised by some of the findings there, especially when we talk about group-level studies later on.
Okay, intrigued. What's number 3?
The third category is fluid intelligence score.
Fluid intelligence.
Yeah, this is basically a measure of someone's general reasoning, problem-solving abilities, their capacity to think flexibly, tackle new problems they haven't seen before.
Okay, so that's less about specific knowledge like math or reading and more about general cognitive horsepower, maybe.
Kind of, yeah. It's a more general amenity. And the fourth type,
The last one.
finally, they looked at socio-demographic characteristics, SC.
Right, the background factors.
Exactly. Things like a student's gender, maybe their family's socioeconomic status, whether they have a migration background, those sorts of things.
So recapping, we have IP, same subject,
Yeah.
CP, different subject, GIF, general reasoning, and SC, background. That seems like a pretty good spread of student characteristics.
It does cover a lot of ground. And to help understand how these different types might work, the researchers also brought in 3, let's call them psychometric heuristics.
Heuristics, okay, rules of thumb.
Yeah, basically general principles or rules of thumb from the world of educational measurement. Helps frame the thinking.
Okay, can you break those down for us? Keep it simple.
Sure. The first one is bandwidth fidelity.
Bandwidth fidelity.
It's this idea that there's often a trade-off, between how broad a covariate is, that's the bandwidth, and how specifically relevant it is to what you're actually trying to measure. That's the fidelity.
Okay, so a specific measure is high fidelity, narrow bandwidth.
Exactly. Like that domain identical pretest, the IP. It's very specific high fidelity. It might be a super strong predictor if it lines up perfectly with your outcome measure.
And a broader one.
A broader one, like maybe fluid intelligence, has wider bandwidth, but maybe lower fidelity for predicting, say, just math skills.
Yeah.
It captures more general factors influencing learning across different areas.
Got it. Trade-off between breadth and specificity. What's the second heuristic?
Second is incremental validity.
Incremental validity. Does it add anything new?
You got it.
Yeah.
It asks, does adding this particular covariate give you significantly more predictive power than what you already have from the covariates you've included?
Right.
Is this new piece of info truly adding valuable insight, or is it just redundant?
Makes sense. You don't want to collect tons of extra data if it isn't really telling you anything more than you already know. Okay, and the third one?
The last one is validity degradation.
Degradation.
Yeah.
So it fades over time.
Precisely. It refers to how the predictive power of a covariate might weaken or degrade over time. A test score from last year is probably going to be a better predictor of how you're doing now compared to a test score from, say, 5 years ago.
Right. That seems pretty intuitive, too.
Mm.
Okay, so we've got the 4 covariate types, IP, CP, GF, SC, and these 3 ideas: bandwidth fidelity, incremental validity, and validity degradation. Let's get into the findings. What did the research actually show about how these different types performed? Let's start with that bandwidth fidelity idea, and maybe begin with studies looking at individual students, the single level, or IRTs.
Okay. So in those studies focusing just on individual student differences, the domain identical pretest, IP, it really stood out.
The high fidelity one.
Exactly. On average, it explained a pretty remarkable 56% of the differences, the variance in student achievement later on.
56%. Wow, that's over half.
Yeah. Think about it. Just by knowing their prior score in the same subject, you can account for more than half of why students perform differently down the track. It's a really strong signal.
That is powerful. What you knew before really does set the stage. How did the other types stack up at this individual level, the broader ones?
Well, the cross-domain pretest, CP, was about half as effective, roughly, explained around 28% of the variance.
Okay, still substantial, but definitely less than IP.
Right. Then fluid intelligence, GROOF, that accounted for around 19%. And the socio-demographic characteristics, SC, explained a much smaller slice, only about 4% on average.
So that bandwidth fidelity idea seems to hold up pretty well here, doesn't it? The more specific high-fidelity measure, IP, was the strongest predictor for individuals.
It does seem that way at the individual level, generally speaking.
But the article also mentioned that the results weren't perfectly consistent across all the studies they looked at.
Oh, definitely not. There was variability. The predictive power of each type, it fluctuated depending on things like the student's grade level.
Younger versus older.
Right. And the specific subject being studied, math, is different from reading, which is different from science. And also, crucially, the time lag, how long between the pretest and the outcome measure.
Okay, that makes sense. You'd expect maybe a longer gap to weaken the connection, like that validity degradation idea.
Yeah.
Now, what about the studies that looked at groups, classrooms or schools, those multi-level or CRT designs? Did the picture change there? Because now we're not just looking at individuals, right?
Right, and the findings here were quite revealing and, in some ways, pretty different from the individual level.
Oh, how so?
Okay, so IP, the domain identical pretest, still very strong. But interestingly, it was particularly strong at the school level, what they call level 3 in the study.
Level 3, the whole school.
Yeah. At that level, IP explained a huge chunk between 73 and 81% of the differences in average achievement between schools.
Whoa, between schools. But what about within schools?
Well, its predictive power was actually somewhat lower when looking at differences between students within the same school, that's level 1,
Oh.
or between classrooms within the same school, level 2.
That's a really interesting split. Strong for comparing schools,
Right.
less so for comparing students or classes within those schools. What about the cross-domain pretest, CP, in these group-level studies, the one that wasn't the same subject?
Okay, now this is where it gets really interesting. Remember how CP explained about 28% at the individual level?
Yeah.
Well, at the school level, level 3, CP was surprisingly strong. It explained around 74% of the variance in average achievement between schools.
74%. For a different subject pretest, that's almost as strong as the same subject pretest at the school level.
I know, right? It's pretty counterintuitive at first glance. At the student level within schools, level 1, CP explained around 30%, which is, more in line with the individual studies. But that school level finding is striking.
Wow. So a measure of, say, reading ability can tell us almost as much about the differences in average math performance between schools as prior math performance itself can. That's, not what I would have guessed. What could be driving that?
That's a great question. The researchers suggest it might be tied to broader school-level factors, things that influence achievement across multiple subjects.
Like the overall academic climate? Or maybe resources?
Exactly. Quality of teaching across the board, school resources, maybe even peer effects at the school level. Things that lift achievement in both reading and math, for example.
That makes sense. A generally high-achieving school environment boosts everything. Okay, what about the sociodemographic characteristics, SC, in these multi-level studies?
Similar pattern, actually. SC also showed a strong predictive ability at the school level, explained about 64% of the variance between schools.
64%, also quite high.
Yes, but just like IP, SC was much weaker when predicting differences at the student level or the classroom level within schools.
So IP, CP, and SC all seem pretty powerful for differentiating between schools, but less so for differentiating within schools. What about fluid intelligence, GUF, in the multi-level context? Had that been looked at much?
That was another interesting point the researchers made. They noted that the predictive power of DUF at these different group levels, classroom and school, hadn't really been studied much before this work.
Ah, so this research provides some new insights there.
Yes, exactly. Into how this general cognitive ability relates to achievement variance at the classroom and school levels, not just the individual level.
Okay. It really sounds like how these different types of prior info predict future achievement is, well, it's complicated. It really depends on whether you're looking at individuals or groups and which group level.
Absolutely. And as we mentioned, there's still considerable variation depending on the specific context of the study. These are general trends from a large data set, but context is king.
Right. The specific subject, the age of the students, the particular educational system like this was Germany, all that matters.
Definitely.
Okay, so we've got a decent handle on how the different types of covariates perform. Now, what about putting them together, combining them? This gets into that incremental validity idea, right? Does adding more and more covariates actually give you a significant boost in prediction? Let's go back to the single level, the IRT studies first. If you already have IP, does adding CP or GIF or SC help much?
Generally speaking, for individual students, not usually a huge amount. Yeah, adding CP, GIF, or SC on top of a good domain-identical pretest, IP, tended to provide only a, let's say, modest increase in predictive power. If you already had that strong, specific measure of prior knowledge.
The other stuff often didn't add a whole lot extra.
That was the general pattern, yes. It suggests that IP captures a lot of the predictable individual variance already.
So maybe not always worth the extra effort of collecting those additional measures if you already have a good recent IP score for individuals?
It depends on the context, but often the added predictive bang for your buck was relatively small. However, there was a bit of an exception noted.
Oh,
In elementary school, in those earlier grades, the researchers found that sometimes adding these other covariates, CP, GIF, SSC to IP, did actually lead to a more meaningful improvement in explaining outcomes.
interesting. So maybe in those foundational years, those broader skills or background factors play a relatively larger role alongside specific prior knowledge.
That could be one interpretation, yeah. Things might be a bit more interconnected early on.
Okay. What about combining covariates in the multi-level, the CRT studies? Did we see a similar pattern there? Less benefit from adding more?
Well, there's actually less previous research specifically on combining CP and GRIF with IP in these multi-level designs. So this study provided some useful new data points.
Good. And what did it find?
What they found was that sociodemographic characteristics, SC, did seem to add predictive value at the group level, so classroom level 2 and school level 3, even after you already accounted for IP.
Ah, so SC adds something extra at the group level, even with IP included.
Yes, and again, this effect was particularly noticeable in elementary school settings.
So summarizing that incremental validity point, maybe piling on covariates isn't always necessary at the individual level, especially if you have a strong IP. But when looking at groups, classrooms, schools, considering sociodemographic factors alongside prior subject knowledge can be worthwhile, particularly for younger students.
That seems like a fair summary of that finding, yes.
Okay, now let's tackle that third heuristic. Validity degradation, the time lag effect.
Yeah.
How does the gap between measuring the covariate and measuring the outcome affect things? Start with the single-level, individual IRT findings again.
Right. This one feels pretty intuitive, as you said earlier. The further back you go, the less relevant it might be.
And did the data bear that out?
Clearly, yes.
Yeah.
Especially for the domain-identical pretest IP, there was a very clear trend. Its predictive power went down as the time lag increased.
How much did it drop?
Well, for instance, the average R-squared, the variance explained by IP, dropped from about 63% with only a 1-year gap,
Okay, pretty strong.
down to just 36% with a 7-year gap.
Wow, 63 down to 36. That's a really substantial decline over that time frame.
It is. It shows that specific subject knowledge, while powerful short-term, does become less predictive of current knowledge quite significantly over several years.
What about the cross-domain pretest, CP? Did its predictive power fade just as fast?
Interestingly, no. The decline for CP was less dramatic than for IP.
Less dramatic.
Yeah. It suggests that maybe those more general skills that a CP taps into, maybe related to reading comprehension or general academic skills, might be a bit more stable in their relationship with future achievement over time, even if they aren't quite as strong a predictor as IP initially.
That's a neat little distinction. Okay, what about fluid intelligence, CREF, over longer time periods for individuals? How did that hold up?
Now, Greff was quite remarkable here. It appeared to be a very stable predictor of future achievement, even over extended periods.
Really?
Stable.
Yeah. The decrease in its predictive power as the time lag got longer was minimal compared to both IP and CP.
So general reasoning ability seems to be a pretty consistent factor influencing learning outcomes, even years later.
That's what the data suggests for individual level prediction. It seems quite robust over time.
Okay, so recapping the time lag for individuals. IP, specific knowledge, fades noticeably. CP, related knowledge, fades less dramatically. Greph, general ability, seems pretty stable. Now, how did these time lag effects look in the multi-level, the CRT studies? Were the patterns similar for groups? It was a bit more nuanced for the multi-level studies. For IP, the time lag effect depended on the level you were looking at.
Oh.
How so? At the student level within schools, level 1, they saw a decrease in IP's power with longer lags, similar to the individual studies. Makes sense.
Right.
But at the school level, level 3, the time lags seemed to have less of a negative impact. IP remained a relatively strong predictor of differences between schools, even with longer time gaps.
Whoa, that's fascinating. So prior math knowledge from years ago might not predict an individual student's current math score very well.
Right.
But it could still be quite good at telling you which schools generally have higher average math achievement, even after several years.
That's the implication, yes. Those school-level differences seem more stable over time, or at least IP remains a good marker for them.
Very interesting distinction. What about CP and graph in the multi-level studies with time lags?
For CP, the research indicated that its decline over time kind of varied. It depended on the grade level and which level of analysis you were focused on, student, classroom, or school. There wasn't one single clear pattern reported there.
Okay, a bit more complex for CP across levels and time. And Griff, did its stability hold up at the group levels too?
Yes, it seems so. Consistent with the individual findings, fluid intelligence, Greff remained relatively stable as a predictor of achievement even at the classroom and school levels over longer periods.
Okay, so that stability of Griff as a predictor, individuals, groups, longer time frames, that seems like a really key finding, doesn't it? Especially for researchers looking at long-term effects.
Absolutely. And suggests Greff could be a particularly valuable covariate in longitudinal research design.
Right. Okay, this is great. We've covered the types, combining them, the time lags. Now, to really make this concrete, you mentioned the researchers included an illustrative scenario.
Yes, they did, to sort of bring it all together and show how these findings could actually guide decisions in practice.
Perfect. Let's hear about that. How can we take all these R-squared values and level effects and apply them to designing a real study?
Okay, so imagine a team of researchers. They've developed a cool new math app, maybe for lower secondary school students, grades 7 or 8 perhaps,
Okay,
and
baffling.
they want to do proper research to see if it actually improves math skills. They're thinking about two possible study designs.
Two options.
Yeah. First, maybe a smaller scale study. They'd randomly assign individual students to either use the app or do some control activity. That's the individually randomized trial, the IRT.
Okay, small-scale individual randomization, option 1.
Option 2. They're also considering a bigger study. This time, they'd randomly assign entire schools to either implement the app school-wide or just stick with their usual curriculum. That's the cluster randomized trial, the CRT.
Got it. Big scale, randomizing whole schools. How does this covariate research help them plan these two different studies? Let's start with the small IRT.
Okay. For that smaller IRT focusing on individual students, a key question is, how many students do we need?
Right, the sample size calculation.
Exactly. They need enough students to reliably spot a meaningful improvement in math schools if the app actually works. They can use the R-squared values reported in this research. Remember, those tell us how much variance is explained by different covariates
Yeah.
to estimate the required sample size. And the findings we discussed make it crystal clear, including a domain-identical pretest, an IP in math.
Will significantly reduce the number of students they need compared to not having any prior math data.
Precisely. It makes the study way more efficient.
Brings us right back to that initial point about design sensitivity and efficiency.
It does. And in the scenario, the researchers even think about adding a cross-domain pretest, maybe a reading test CP.
Okay.
They look at the R-squared values from the article for IP alone versus IP plus CP. Their analysis, guided by this research, might show that, yeah, the reading pretest adds some extra predictive power.
Yeah, maybe not a huge amount.
Right. And the reduction in the required sample size might be relatively small, so then they can make an informed trade-off.
Okay, weigh the benefit of needing slightly fewer kids against the extra cost and time of giving another test.
Exactly. They're using the data from this deep dive research to make practical design decisions, balancing statistical power with feasibility.
That's a great illustration for the IRT. Now, what about the big CRT? Randomizing schools. They might have different constraints there. Right?
Definitely. For the CRT, maybe the biggest constraint is logistical.
Yeah.
Perhaps they can only realistically get, say, 40 schools to participate, not hundreds.
Okay, limited number of clusters of
No.
schools.
Right, so now their main worry shifts. It's less about minimizing student numbers within schools and more about, do we have enough statistical power to see an effect given we only have 40 schools?
The power calculation depends heavily on the number of clusters in the CRT.
Exactly, and maybe doing extensive subject-specific pretests across thousands of students in 40 different schools is just too difficult or expensive.
So they need to think about other covariates, ones that are maybe easier to collect but still give them decent power, especially at that crucial school level.
Precisely. So they might look at the findings for more general covariates like fluid intelligence, GF, or sociodemographic characteristics, SC. Specifically, they'd look at the predictive power, the R-squared values of GF and SC at the school level, level 3.
Okay, and they'd also consider those pooled values mentioned in the outline. What are those again?
Ah, yes, the POOLDRA, the interclass correlation coefficient. That basically tells you how similar, on average, students within the same school are to each other compared to students in different schools. It's another key piece for power calculations in CRTs.
Got it. So they look at the school level R-squareds for GF and SC and maybe the ICCs. How does comparing GF and SC help them decide?
Well, they can compare the R-squared values at level 3 for GF versus SC. This gives them an idea. Which of these more easily gathered measures is likely to be a stronger predictor of differences between our 40 schools? Which will give us more power.
And what might the research suggest there?
The research, particularly considering the time stability findings, might suggest that in certain contexts, especially if they're interested in longer-term effects, fluid intelligence, DFF, could actually be a more stable and powerful predictor at the school level than some SC factors.
So even if they can't do detailed math pretests everywhere, they might decide to collect a measure of fluid intelligence from students in all 40 schools.
They might, because that GIF measure could potentially give them better statistical power to detect the apps effect between schools compared to relying only on, say, aggregated SC data, especially if the intervention runs for a year or more.
Right, leveraging that stability of view over time.
Exactly. So the scenario really drives home that it's not just about finding the single best covariate in a vacuum.
Yeah.
Researchers have to weigh the predictive power against the logistics, the cost, the scale of the study, IRT versus CRT, the level they care most about, student versus school, and even the time frame.
And the research also mentioned being mindful of the uncertainty in these estimates, right? These R-squared values are averages from past studies.
Absolutely crucial point. These are valuable estimates, but they aren't perfect predictors for your specific future study. There's always uncertainty, so you need to be thoughtful and maybe even run sensitivity analyses based on slightly different assumptions.
This really ties it all together nicely. It shows how this kind of detailed methodological research on covariate selection has very real, practical implications for designing studies that are actually effective and efficient.
Exactly. It's not just some abstract statistical exercise. It directly impacts the quality of educational research and our ability to figure out what works for students.
And it brings us back, like you said, to the goal of this deep dive. Giving listeners useful knowledge without them having to wade through dense academic papers themselves.
Right. Understanding these principles, backed by solid evidence like this, gives you a real advantage if you're involved in planning, funding, or even just interpreting educational studies.
Okay, fantastic. Let's bring it all home then. Let's summarize the key insights, the main takeaways from our deep dive into covariate selection for educational studies. What should our listeners really remember?
Okay, takeaway number one. Well-chosen covariates. They are incredibly powerful tools. They boost the sensitivity of your study.
Meaning you're more likely to see a real effect if there is one.
Exactly. And they save resources, time, money, participant burden. Plus, they increase your confidence in the results you get. So use them wisely.
Definitely. Smart research practice. What's another key point?
Domain-identical pretests, IP, measuring the same subject beforehand, generally pack the biggest punch. They're usually the strongest single predictors, especially for individual student outcomes.
There's a but.
But
Yeah.
remember validity degradation. Their predictive power tends to decrease, sometimes quite a bit, over longer time periods, so recent IP is better than old IP.
Got it. Recent same-subject knowledge is gold, but its shine fades over time. What else?
Those other types, cross-domain pretests, CP, fluid intelligence, or GF, and sociodemographic characteristics, SC, they can also be really valuable.
Okay.
But their usefulness really depends on the specifics. Is it an IRT or a CRT? What grade level? Are you focused on individual differences or group differences, classroom, school?
Context matters hugely. It's not a simple always use X answer.
Definitely not. It's nuanced. And related to that, another point, don't assume more is always better.
With covariates.
Yeah, combining lots of covariates doesn't always give you a significant improvement, especially if you already have a strong predictor like a good IP. Often, the incremental validity is small.
So prioritize quality and relevance
Hmm.
over just sheer quantity of pre-measures.
That seems to be a sensible approach based on this research.
Mm-hmm.
Now, one covariate that stood out was GI, fluid intelligence.
Right, it's stability.
Exactly. It seems to be a remarkably stable predictor across different study designs, IRT, CRT, and also over longer timeframes. That makes it particularly interesting for longitudinal research looking at lasting impacts.
A reliable workhorse, maybe? Good to know.
And the final big takeaway, perhaps the most important, context is everything.
Say more.
These findings come from large German data sets. While the principles likely generalize, the exact R-squared values or the relative importance of SC versus GIF might differ in other populations, other school systems, other academic subjects, or with different time lags.
So use this research as strong guidance, but always think critically about how it applies to your specific research question and setting. Don't just copy and paste the numbers.
Precisely. Critical application is key.
Okay. This deep dive, hopefully, has given everyone listening a shortcut to being much better informed on this pretty complex but really important topic.
Yeah, we aim to pull out the core insights, maybe highlight some surprising facts like that strength of CP at the school level, and
Ugh.
perhaps spark some aha moments about designing more powerful studies.
Definitely some eye-openers for me.
Hmm.
So, to leave our listeners with a final thought, something to chew on. Consider how these ideas, thinking carefully about what you measure before you try something new, might apply beyond formal research. How could you use existing information to get a clearer, more accurate picture of the impact of, say, a new initiative at work, or even a learning approach you try yourself? What's your covariate?
That's a great question to ponder. And for anyone who really wants to get into the weeds, the original research article has a huge amount of extra detail in its online supplemental material.
Right, more data, more analyses.
Oh, yeah. Extensive tables, methodology details. If you're designing a study, it's definitely worth checking out. It's linked on the Open Science Framework, OSF. The link mentioned in the outline was osf.ionax4wdello.
Perfect. Thanks for sharing that resource. And thank you for joining us for this deep dive.
My pleasure.
Until our next exploration, keep questioning and keep learning.